Hello, can you hear me?
Good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon, Mr. Rakesh.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you very well. We can start.
Perfect. Shall we give like 1 minute more? So if there's any attendees would like to join, is it okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I believe we should start now. So first, I would like to welcome all of you today to our 2020 new webinar series that is hosted by Fiber to the Home Council MENA. Our welcome extends to our members and their partners, and we hope all of you join us, if not in the council, and you enjoy the benefits from today's webinar. I would like to thank as well our council members, Sterlite Technologies, in accepting our invitation for this initiative and led the way with the 3 of special matter experts speaking during these webinars. Starting with today's subject on connector cleaning, practical considerations, and 2 more sessions coming on the 18th of June and 25th of June addressing bent and sensitive fiber improved network installation, performance, and maintenance. And the other subject will be convergence of FTTH and 5G network. Our speaker today, Mr. Rakesh, accepted to fill our first announced speaker, Mr. Terry Power, who unfortunately tested positive for COVID-19, and we wish him speed recovery and good health. This also stands as a reminder for all of us to be safe and be cautious as the world opens up, not to consider the risk gone. Without further ado, let me introduce Mr. Rakesh for all of you. So Mr. Rakesh Samparaju is the head of application engineering and business development at Sterlite Americas. He holds a Master of Science in Telecommunications from the Technical University of Denmark and a PhD from Universidad Politécnica de Valencia, Spain, and held various technical roles at Nexans and Corning. He has more than 15 years of experience in telecommunications, where he worked on different applications involving fiber optics communications and networks. He has published more than 70 papers in international journals and conferences and authored several patents. He is a member of the IEEE Photonics Society and has previously participated in the 802.3 and TIA standardization activities and acts as a reviewer for scientific journals and publications. So, Mr. Rakesh, I'm very happy to welcome you today, and I believe I borrowed a few extra minutes of your time. So I will step aside and give you the full floor, but I would like to tell all the attendees that all the questions they need to ask, please leave them in the chat area, and I will ask them to Mr. Rakesh at the end of this webinar so he can answer all the questions. Thanks again, Mr. Rakesh, and go ahead, please.
Thank you, Khalud. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rakesh Sambaraju. I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's a nice, beautiful morning here. I'm sure it's late in the evening for you. So thank you for your patience and listening to what I have to say. So what we're going to talk about today is mostly on the connector inspection and cleaning side of things. I want to explain why connector cleaning is important, and also a few methods of how to clean it, how to inspect it, and hopefully we'll go through some of the tips and tricks at the end, and I'll answer any questions if you have after this. So let's just look at a very general overview of what a connector looks like, right? So what you see in the screen, can you all see the screen, right? Hello?
Yeah,
Just
it's
want to make
obvious.
sure. Yes. So what you have is the bulkhead adapter where you plug in your connector, right? So if you look at the dark blue portion of this diagram, that's the connector. The main component of the connector is the ferrule, which is what mates the other end of your connection point, right? So that's the ferrule is the tip of your fiber, and it mates into the connector, and that's where the physical contact between one fiber and the other fiber actually happens. Also, that is the most weakest point in any fiber optic link, and it is very important that we make sure that particular physical contact is pristine and free of any contamination. So what exactly is a good fiber connection, right? So what I call it, or even other people in the industry call it, the 3 Ps. One, we need a perfect core alignment, perfect physical contact, and a pristine connector interface, right? Previously, when we started as an industry, when we started making these connectors, there were some challenges in the core alignment. So that was the biggest problem that we were trying to solve. As the industry evolved and we are way advanced, the core alignment is not the main concern. The main concern is us human beings who are handling that and how we make sure these connectors are clean. So what happens when a connector is not clean, right? So let's take an example where you have some dirt particles lodged in between these two connectors. So some of the things that can happen with that is, one, you may not get a perfect connection, right? So if the dirt particle is strong or it's solid, it may not completely align or touch. So that one, you will have some insertion loss, which means your signal power goes down a bit. The other bigger problem, I think, is the back reflection. So what happens when you have dirt in between, and which potentially causes some misalignment, a small portion of the light that is supposed to transmit to the other end actually reflects back. That back reflection is a bigger issue in telecom networks, especially when you're closer to the active equipment. What we also see from a enterprise network perspective, as you start using 100 gig and 400 gig technologies in your data centers, the signals become much sensitive to the back reflection, right? So maybe at 10 gig, you're not that concerned, but when you do 100 or 400 gig, a tiny amount of back reflection may degrade your signals and potentially have some network issues. So two issues with poor connection, mainly from a communication perspective. One, insertion loss, which means a lossy connector, and two, back reflection, which need to be avoided. So let's look at, okay, first, how do we know a connector is dirty, right? So the best way to understand a contamination on the connector is actually physically looking at it. There are many ways you can do that. The handheld device, the most common, at least that's the one that I'm familiar and used to in my career. You just plug in the connector to the end and you look on the other end. It's a microscope, technically. There are other ways. For example, you have a handheld device with a probe where you can extend and put the connector in, so you don't have to use your hand and look into the microscope, right? So essentially, optical way of determining how your end face is contaminated is the best way. And so once you've inspected, and again, our recommendation is at least a 200x or a 400x power, mostly for a single mode, which is about 9 micron core, which is a smaller core compared to a multi-mode fiber, 400 times magnification is recommended. So the procedure is first you inspect, then you clean, and then probably inspect again, and then plug into the network. So let's look at some of the connector contaminations that. So there are many ways that that you can get contaminated, right? We talked about dust to begin with. So the dust could be any size. For example, a 1 micrometer dust particle, theoretically can cover up to 1% of light, which is 0.05 dB. A 9 micrometer speck is also small to see without a microscope, right? So there can be different sizes of contamination that we need to worry about. But let's look at some of the things that can actually contaminate your connector. Apart from dust, one of the other major contamination is oil. Basically, our fingers sometimes get oily, and if we are not careful, that even if we slightly touch a connector end face, the oil from our skin can go onto the connector end face and contaminate that. The film residues condense to vapor in the air, especially in a controlled environment. When the connector is mated properly over time, there may be some vapor deposition there, condensation, that can over time cause the connector contamination. Other things like when you're prepping a connector, there may be the coating, the powder coating that can come out. Sometimes, even after cleaning, there may be residual drops of alcohol that get evaporated and leave some dust particles on it. So there are many ways your connector can get contaminated, and we've identified these as the main culprits. So I talked about this, but again, I want to highlight the caution here, especially in the telecom networks closer to the equipment. We use high-powered lasers, right? If you're looking at long-haul transmission, or even at an amplifier stage, the power coming out of the connector is pretty high. So if that connector is not that clean, the portion of the light, even though the portion of the light that reflects back is insignificant in terms of ratio, if the power of the light coming in is pretty high, the reflected back could be significant to cause damage either to the connector, it would somehow burn the end face, or it can go back to the active equipment and damage some of the active equipment too, right? So it is very important, especially when you're closer to the active equipment, it is very important to make sure the connectors are very, very clean. So let's take a look at how what happens over time when an not fully cleaned connector is placed. I hope the graphics work here. Oh, sorry, they don't. So I'll talk about what happens is if you don't fully clean the connector, let's say, and you leave a small microparticle on it, and you mate it with the other connector, that particle can potentially explode, let's say, and create multiple small little particles. And over time, that can even damage the end face of the connector, right? So it is very important that any particle, even though it is small, we need to make sure that it is out of the connector face to make sure it does not damage the other one or expand and create more loss in your network. So let's look at how a typical a clean end face should look like. So here is an example of what we are showing is an ideal end face look through a 200x magnification. What you'll see is the core. Again, core, it doesn't have to be illuminated all the time, and depends on what's on the other end. You may just see a very small dot or very subtle distinction between the core and the cladding. So what you need to see is a very clear image without any obstruction on the end face, right? So ideally, that's how it would look like. And a clean connector should have no signs of dirt, should have no signs of any visual imperfections. Like, for example, oil or water can create some bumps in the view. You know that it's either some kind of a liquid contamination that's going on. So some of the factors, right? For example, I have 4 cases here. On the left, you can see dirt. I mean, just particles of dirt, lint, etc., on the end face of the connector. That's how it would look like. Alcohol is a contamination cause too. For example, you've cleaned it with an alcohol-based cleaner. Maybe it has too much of alcohol, or it didn't dry correctly, so you could still see some residue of alcohol, and that's what it would look like on the top right. Skin oil, again, it has a different viscosity, so you'll see a different manifestation of it visually. So the bottom right is what you see if you had some kind of oil, skin or otherwise present. And sometimes there are scratches on the end face, right? I mean, over time, these scratches could come, or, because it was not cleaned properly and mated a few times, that solid dirt particles can cause some scratches, and that's how it would look like in the top, the bottom left image. So let's look at each one of those, right? So this is, again, a detailed view of a dust particle in the connector. Ideally, if it is just a solid dust, you would see lumps of contamination here and there. So it won't be a fluid view. This is what you should expect when it is only contaminated by dust. Liquid contamination, again, self-explanatory. What you can see here is an image of a connector with liquid on its end face. So you see a continuous visual disturbance there that represents that something liquid is actually blocking the end face of your connector. Again, it depends on how much of liquid you have. This is another example where it looks like it was submerged in water, but what you can see there is a lot of liquid on the end face of connector, and you can clearly see that needs a thorough cleaning. Different sizes. This is a small droplet. Again, I think once you put it in the microscope, the droplet got distributed to the outside, but you can still see the very tiny amount of contamination is clearly visible and will impact your system performance there. This is one example that is interesting, right? So this is technically a clean connector because you've cleaned it, but if you don't take out all the alcohol that is on the end face, it would still be considered as a contamination, right? So this is an example where after cleaning it with alcohol, there is still some residual alcohol, which may either need a dry cleaning, just take a dry lint-free wipe and wipe it off. So even though we think that we've cleaned the connector, there are cases where you would see either improper cleaning or not using proper methods of cleaning can actually leave some residue. So second inspection sometimes is not a bad idea to follow. Oil residue, again, similar story, right? Here we see an example of very little oil on the connector. But again, no matter how little the contamination is, it still needs cleaning because it would block some portion of the light. Now, scratches. This is a good example of a connector with scratches, right? So even though in this case you cannot clean a scratch off, and sometimes the scratches may be on the outer side of the cladding, which is fine. But when the scratches are closer to the core or even on the cladding, that tells that you need to replace the connector. And it also depends on the depth of the connector. Scratches can happen in many ways. I mean, poor handling of the connector, obviously, or trying to clean it off your shirt or with your fingers. I mean, I've seen those cases. So unfortunately, if the connector is really scratched, the best option moving forward is to replace that particular connector. Now, chipping is an issue too. So, for example, what you see here is a small chip on the outer edge of the cladding, right? Again, this is something we cannot clean, but inspection of the connector would point that there is chipping that has happened on the connector. Sometimes, if the chipping is, or any contamination, if it's just on the outer edge of the cladding, for example, in this case, this is a very small chip at the outer edge. Sometimes it can work. If optically the performance looks good, it should be fine. But for foolproof operation, our recommendation would be replace the connector. So this is another one, which is an over-chamfered ferrule. Basically, there's nothing that could be done here. It's a damaged connector, and that must be replaced. So we also have to be cautious. We are mating the right connector to the right adapter, for example, or we're not using excessive force when we're plugging in or plugging out of those connectors. So physical damages to the connector is also part of the issue at hand sometimes. So that's what we covered, is the inspection piece, right? So once you inspect the connector, any different kind of contamination can happen. It could be dirt, and we've seen some images of how dirt-based contamination would look like. We've also seen some cases where residual alcohol, in good intention, someone cleaned it, but did not clean the whole, or did not do the effort of removing all the residual alcohol. That could be an issue. Connector breaking could be an issue, right? So that is covered under inspection, and why inspection is very important, right? Now let's look at some of the cleaning products that are available here. So the process here, I'm not going to run through the whole this, but it's very simple logic, right? So before you start doing anything with the connector, you plug it into an end face scope to make sure if it's clean or not. If the end face looks clean, free of contamination, if the end face does not look like any of the 10-15 images that we've seen in the last 5 minutes, you're good to go. Plug the connector, life is happy, right? But if it is not, then the first step would be a dry clean. Just clean with a lint-free wipe, and it should be able to clean any residual dirt that's left. Recommendation is double check again, make another inspection. If it's clean, let's plug it in. If it's not, let's give it another try. But if with your dry clean method, if the connector's end face is not getting clean, then you need to use the wet wipe. So then you use a wet clean method, alcohol-based mostly. Inspect again. If it is clean, fine, put that in. If not, clean it a few times and plug it in. If after cleaning many times, you know that you still see some contamination, let's say, on that, it's most likely a scratch or a chip in the connector, right? That's when you know you need to replace. So always inspect, clean, inspect, and connect. These are the 4 guiding principles behind plugging a connector. So there are various tools available in cleaning. I think you all are well aware of what they are. So the most common method is the isopropyl alcohol, 99%. It has to be. Anything less, it's not the best cleaning agent for connector. Then you also have wipes. You have some other chemicals. So ideally, in our toolkit, what we need is alcohol, wipes, a scope to visualize things, and other cleaning tools. So, for example, the dry cleaning, there are lint-free wipes. There are also swabs that you can clean the end face of the connector. What we suggest, and I think it's a well-known fact, that do not use any dry air. Like, for example, I use a dry air to clean my keyboard once in a while. That's not a good method to clean a connector because it can actually blow dust particles onto the connector, right? So best method is wiping, alcohol or dry, in this case, would work. Now on the wet cleaning methods, so Kim wipes and 99% isopropyl are probably the foolproof things. And alco wipes is another solution that's about 90%. There is the noise cleaning connector, for example. On the dry, the standard ones are the clay top solutions and the Chemtronics cube cleaner. Those come in very handy when you want to do a dry clean. There are cases where you can't really access the end face of the connector, right? So all you can do is access it through the other end of the adapter. So cleaning sticks come in handy where you clean the back end of the connector from the front of the adapter panel. So cleaning sticks pretty good. Cleaning fluid, you can buy the can, so you can spray some liquid in it and then clean with the dry stick. So that's the best way of cleaning a connector, which you can't really access the ferrule. So some of the tips when you're cleaning with alcohol, right? So the first step is never leave any alcohol on the connector, but even if you think there is some, don't let it dry because once the alcohol evaporates, it leaves some kind of residual. And once that residue is left, it becomes very hard sometimes to clean. So it has to be cleaned at the initiation of this. And sometimes, there are these tiny, there's no perfect alignment in this world. So sometimes the alcohol can get into the cracks and the crevices of the connector. And once you plug it in, and due to the changes in the force and the friction, that alcohol can come back and contaminate the connector. So even though sometimes you see there is nothing clean, you have to make sure, you either clean it with a wipe, with a dry wipe before you plugging it in to make sure not only on the connector, but on the edges of the connector, you have not left any alcohol, residual alcohol. Again, I mean, I think it's a well-known fact that there's no 100% cleaning, right? I mean, we see the advertisements where it's all 99.9% kill all the germs. It's the same thing here. No method is foolproof, so we have to make sure. Inspect, clean, inspect would ensure that at least you get close to 100% effectiveness. Improper cleaning is a bigger concern, especially with it can damage the equipment. So inspect, clean, inspect, and plug, I think is the mantra here. Storage of cleaning products. I mean, it is important how we store. For example, if you don't properly seal the containers, some of the cleaning agent can dry and either stay on the wipe or on the lid, etc. So we have to make sure that all the cleaning products are well sealed. Dust can collect on top of that. So sometimes we ignore that part. I'm talking about myself mostly here. But it is important that cleaning is as important as making sure that the products that are cleaning these connectors are well maintained and stored. So let's look some of the nevers, right? And even though never say never, there are a few points where we should never do. So never use alcohol or wet cleaning wipe without making sure that you're not going to leave any residue on the end face, right? So that could mean either over time, exactly how much of alcohol to be used or how many times you have to swipe, or you use a dry mechanism right after using a wet mechanism to clean it. This goes without saying, but the first step in inspecting a cable or an end face is to make sure that it is not plugged into any active equipment, right? So that could be a significant health issue if you look into an active connector with a microscope. So please make sure that nothing is plugged in before we do that. And never clean the bulkheads or receptacle, right, without a way to inspect them. Because if you cannot inspect them and if you clean them, you don't know what's left on that. Never touch any product without properly being grounded, especially when you're on the active equipment side. Make sure that equipment is grounded, there is no light, and then move forward with cleaning. Keep, never use the unfiltered handheld magnifiers, right? Sometimes or focus optics to inspect the fiber cleaning. Never connect a fiber to a fiber scope while the system lasers are on. That's just repeating this will not hurt anyone. So make sure no active equipment or no light is passing through. This again goes without saying. There is no reason for any of us to touch the end face of the connector. So the issue with touching the connector, even accidentally, is the fact that the dust particles on our fingers, or even the oils on the fingers, can get lodged down the connector end face. In the process of inspection, when you're trying to take the connector out, never use excessive force. If the connector is stuck, we need to understand why it is stuck. But using excessive force might potentially damage, right? Never reuse any tissue swab or cleaning cassette reel. That's again one of the golden principles. If you do that, you have a chance of contamination, or the effectiveness of the cleaning product is diminished once you try to reuse that. When you're using any of the cleaning mechanisms, so let's say you're using a cleaning stick or a wipe or a swab, please make sure you don't touch it, touch the clean portion, because if you touch it, then the cleaner gets contaminated, and that contamination will go on the subject that is being cleaned, right? So those are basically the main important pieces, right? Make sure there is no light coming in. Make sure you don't use excessive force before you take the connector out. Make sure you don't touch the end face of the connector, and make sure you store the cleaning solutions properly, especially the alcohol, the 99% alcohol, which is highly inflammable. So you have to make sure it is stored properly and in a proper location. Now, some of the things that we must do. So again, always make sure you turn off any laser source before you inspect anything. Always make sure that the cable is disconnected at both the ends, right? So make sure that it is not connected to a transceiver, or remove the transceiver from the chassis if you have to. Safety glasses is always important. It's a must. I mean, especially in the United States, we have rules and regulations around that we have to use them. And I'm assuming every other country in the world imposes some safety standards. So it is advisable to use safety glasses when you're trying to inspect or maintain any fiber optic equipment, right? Always inspect the connector before you clean. So for example, if you suspect an extra loss coming from a connection point, before you determine that it is because contamination, and before you go to clean it, make sure it is actually contaminated, and make sure it is the right connection point that is causing the trouble in your network. Always inspect. So once you inspect it, always inspect and then clean the connector before you make any connection, right? So my golden rule is, if I plug the connector out for whatever reason, right, I'm trying to change the connection point or whatever, the moment I disconnect the connector from the port, I inspect and clean it, even with or without it being dirty. Once it's in the air, I'm assuming that there is some dirt particle that may get lodged on top of it. I go ahead, inspect, and clean it. The connectors have the protective caps, so that's also advisable. Mostly from a damage perspective, I would not recommend using the connector cap as a method to protect it against contamination. I'm sure there is some protection, but there may be some dust particles in the connector cap itself. So make sure when you put a connector cap on the ferrule or on the connector itself, and you take it out, you make sure you clean it again, because you never know what the cap has, right? I usually store the unprotected caps in a nice sealable container so they don't get dirty. And discarding the used tissues, always use the proper precaution and proper regulations in discarding chemical and alcohol based or any cleaning product. Make sure you always use proper disposal mechanisms. So I think that's what a very basic overview of how to inspect clean a connector would look like. I'd be happy to take any questions and engage in a conversation.
Well, I can't thank you enough, Mr. Rakesh. Very informative session, actually. And I would ask all the attendees if they have any questions. Maybe they can send me their questions on the chat area. So apparently no questions.
I will. So let me give an anecdote on what we're doing. So we're part of the standardization body, right? So I was attending some of these over the last few years, and one of the things I've seen is the strict requirement on the reflectance of a connector. So once we started doing this advanced modulation formats like PAM4 for data center, now the standard says that every connector should have a minimum amount of back reflection. That was not the case with 10 gig and 40 gig, especially from a data center environment perspective. So just to emphasize on that again, as we go higher and higher in speed, the connector cleaning becomes much more important than probably what it was.
Perfect. So if anybody, please, the attendees, if they have any question or anything they want to share, you can just enable the microphone and you can share with us your point of view or your question. So I guess it's clear, Mr. Rakesh.
Thank you.
Just there are somebody typing. Just 1 minute. So instead of typing, you just can enable the microphone if you want to speak or you want to share anything. So Mr. Abdulaziz, thank you very much. He is thanking you, Mr. Rakesh. And he said everything was clear. Mr. Nizar Abu Zaid, thanks for your time and helpful information. And Mr. Manfred, as I came in a bit late, can this be seen as a recorded session? Yes, the session was recorded. I will send everybody who attended this session the link, so you can review all the slides, and we are happy if you have any question or anything, we are happy to help you or to answer. So Mr. Rakesh, thank you very much. Thank you for all the information and all the slides that you prepared in a very short note. And until we meet again in the next webinar next week, thank you very much, Mr. Rakesh.
Thank you. Thanks all for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.